December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Navy surgeon Lieutenant Commander Harold Jensen stood in what remained of the USS Arizona's medical bay, his hands slick with blood that would not stop flowing. Around him, sailors screamed for help he could not give. The blood storage refrigerator lay crushed beneath twisted metal. Every glass bottle of whole blood had shattered in the first minutes of the attack. By noon, Jensen had watched 17 men bleed to death from wounds that should have been survivable. Their hearts kept beating, their lungs kept breathing, but their veins ran empty, and there was nothing left to fill them. Within 48 hours, this American naval surgeon would discover that the Japanese had not just destroyed ships, they had exposed the fatal weakness in every military medical system on Earth. Blood could not travel to war. The mathematics of hemorrhagic shock were brutal and unchanging in 1941. A soldier who lost 30% of his blood volume entered irreversible shock within 15 minutes, lose 50%, and death arrived in 5. The human body was, at its core, a hydraulic system, and when pressure dropped below critical thresholds, organs began to fail in a cascading sequence that no amount of surgical skill could reverse. American military medical doctrine in 1941 relied on 3 primary methods for treating hemorrhagic shock. 1. Direct transfusion from donor to recipient, requiring blood type matching, a donor present at the point of injury, and specialized equipment rarely available in forward positions. 2. Stored whole blood in glass bottles, effective for 7 days maximum if refrigerated constantly, impossible to transport across oceans, and prone to catastrophic breakage under any combat conditions. 3. Saline and glucose solutions, which replaced fluid volume but carried no oxygen, provided no clotting factors, and offered only temporary stabilization before inevitable organ failure. These methods represented the absolute limit of 1941 military medicine. They were also fundamentally inadequate for modern warfare. Harold Jensen had graduated from Northwestern University Medical School in 1932. He'd served as a Navy medical officer since 1935, rotating through destroyers, cruisers, and finally the Pacific Fleet headquarters at Pearl Harbor. By December 1941, Jensen commanded the medical response coordination for the entire harbor, a position that placed him at the center of America's worst naval disaster. His facility that morning consisted of 1 intact operating theater at the base hospital, beds overflowing into corridors and parking lots, 6 surgeons working without pause, dwindling supplies of morphine and bandages, stored blood for perhaps 50 transfusions before the refrigerators were destroyed. No method to preserve blood beyond 7 days, even if donors could be found. The Pearl Harbor attack produced 2,400, 3 American deaths, and 1,178 wounded in less than 2 hours. Jensen's medical team saved hundreds, but the casualties who died from hemorrhagic shock numbered in the dozens, men whose wounds were entirely survivable, if only their blood volume could have been restored. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. December 8th, 1941. Jensen filed his after-action medical report. The document was 17 pages of clinical observations, casualty statistics, and resource expenditures. But buried in the appendices was a single paragraph that would reshape American military medicine. Primary cause of preventable death: hemorrhagic shock, secondary to inadequate blood volume replacement. Glass bottle storage system failed completely under combat conditions. Whole blood inventory insufficient for mass casualty event. Recommend urgent development of preserved blood product suitable for forward deployment and extended storage without refrigeration. The report reached the desk of Surgeon General Thomas Parran within 72 hours. Parran had been tracking the European war's medical developments since 1939. He knew that British forces had pioneered dried plasma for their troops, that Soviet physicians were experimenting with preserved blood products, that German medical research had explored synthetic blood substitutes. But American military medicine had remained committed to traditional whole blood transfusion, believing that nothing could match fresh blood's oxygen-carrying capacity. Pearl Harbor changed everything. The attack demonstrated that America's enemies could strike anywhere, that casualties would occur far from established medical facilities, and that the existing blood supply system would fail, catastrophically under the pressures of global war. Within 1 week, Parran convened an emergency meeting of the National Research Council's Subcommittee on Blood Substitutes. The committee members represented the elite of American medical research, Dr. Charles Drew from Columbia University, who had supervised the Blood for Britain program and developed revolutionary blood preservation techniques, Dr. Isidore Ravdin from the University of Pennsylvania, an expert in shock physiology, Dr. Edwin Cohn from Harvard Medical School, a protein chemist who had been quietly experimenting with blood fractionation, Dr. Max Strumier from Philadelphia, who had pioneered the use of preserved plasma. Their assignment was simple in concept, impossible in execution. Develop a blood product that could be stored without refrigeration, transported across oceans, administered without blood type matching, and remained effective for months or years. Create, essentially, liquid life in a package. The committee's first meeting occurred on January 5, 1942, in a conference room at the National Academy of Sciences in Washington. Outside, snow fell across a capital city rapidly transforming for total war. Inside, 12 men reviewed everything humanity knew about blood and realized how little that actually was. Blood consists of 4 primary components: red blood cells, which carry oxygen to tissues, white blood cells, which fight infection, platelets, which enable clotting, and plasma, the yellowish liquid that comprises 55% of blood volume and contains proteins, antibodies, clotting factors, and the biochemical machinery that keeps humans alive. Whole blood transfusion required matching donor and recipient blood types, because red blood cells carry antigens, proteins on their surface that trigger immune responses if incompatible types mix. Type A blood mixed with type B blood would cause the recipient's immune system to attack the foreign cells, resulting in hemolytic reactions that could kill faster than the original injury. Blood typing solved this problem, but required laboratory testing, trained technicians, and careful matching that took time casualties did not have. Plasma was different. Remove the cellular components, separate the liquid, and what remained was a universal fluid that any recipient could receive, regardless of blood type. Plasma carried no cellular antigens, triggered no immune reactions, and could be given to any wounded soldier without testing. It would not carry oxygen like red blood cells, but it would restore blood volume, maintain blood pressure, deliver clotting factors, and keep a casualty alive long enough to reach surgical facilities where whole blood could be administered. The challenge was preservation. Fresh plasma could be stored for only a few days before bacterial contamination rendered it lethal. Freezing plasma preserved it indefinitely, but required constant refrigeration and made transport impossible. The solution that the committee proposed was simultaneously ancient and revolutionary: freeze-drying, a process known technically as lyophilization. The principle was straightforward. Freeze liquid plasma to -40 degrees Celsius. Place it in a vacuum chamber. Apply gentle heat. The frozen water would sublimate directly from solid to vapor, bypassing the liquid phase entirely. What remained was a yellowish powder containing all of plasma's proteins, clotting factors, and biochemical components, stable at room temperature for years, weighing a fraction of liquid plasma's weight, requiring only distilled water to reconstitute into fully functional plasma in minutes. Freeze-drying had been used for decades to preserve food, vaccines, and bacterial cultures, but applying it to human blood plasma at industrial scale, with sufficient quality control to ensure every package was sterile and fully functional, represented an engineering challenge that no nation had ever attempted. Dr. Edwin Cohn volunteered to lead the plasma production program. His laboratory at Harvard Medical School had been experimenting with protein fractionation, the process of separating plasma into its component proteins for research purposes. Scaling that work to produce thousands of units per week would require new equipment, new facilities, and new manufacturing protocols that did not yet exist. The timeline was impossible. The committee estimated they needed 6 months to develop the process, another 6 months to build production facilities, and at least a year of clinical testing before dried plasma could be safely deployed. But American forces were already fighting in the Pacific. Casualties were mounting daily. Every week of delay meant more deaths from hemorrhagic shock. Cone committed to 3 months for process development. The military committed to building production facilities even before the process was proven. And the American Red Cross committed to recruiting millions of blood donors to supply the raw material. It was the kind of desperate gamble that only total war could justify, and only American industrial capacity could attempt. February 19, 1942. Cone's laboratory at Harvard processed its first batch of experimental dried plasma. The freeze-drying took 18 hours. The yield was 12 packages, each containing enough reconstituted plasma for 1 transfusion. When mixed with distilled water, the powder dissolved into a clear yellow liquid indistinguishable from fresh plasma. The quality control testing was exhaustive. Sterility checks to ensure no bacterial contamination. Protein assays to verify all clotting factors remained functional. pH testing to confirm the solution would not damage tissues. Pyrogenicity testing to ensure no fever-causing substances remained. Each test took hours or days, and failure at any stage meant discarding the entire batch and starting over. Of the first 12 packages, 9 passed all tests. 3 contained trace bacterial contamination and were destroyed. The success rate was 75%, which would have been acceptable for experimental medicine, but was catastrophically inadequate for mass production. At 75% success, 1 in 4 wounded soldiers would receive contaminated plasma that could kill them as surely as their wounds. Cone's team worked without pause to identify contamination sources. They discovered that plasma collected in hospital settings often carried bacteria from donors' skin despite careful cleaning. They found that the freeze-drying equipment itself harbored bacterial colonies in seams and joints that standard sterilization could not eliminate. They learned that the distilled water used for reconstitution had to meet pharmaceutical purity standards that most military water supplies could not match. By March 1942, they had refined the process to achieve 98% sterility. By April, they reached 99.5%. The remaining failures were random and unavoidable, the statistical noise inherent in any biological manufacturing process. It was good enough for production to begin. The American Red Cross launched its blood donation campaign in March 1942. The goal was 100,000 donations per month, enough to produce 30,000 packages of dried plasma after processing losses. The campaign exceeded its goal in the first week. By June 1942, monthly donations reached 400,000. By December, over 1 million Americans per month were donating blood for plasma production. The scale was unprecedented in human history. Blood donation centers operated in schools, churches, union halls, and shopping districts in every major city. The Red Cross deployed bloodmobiles, modified buses equipped with refrigeration and collection equipment to reach rural communities. Donors ranged from Hollywood celebrities to factory workers to school children who organized drives in their communities. The cultural impact was profound. Blood donation became an act of patriotism, a way for civilians to directly support the war effort. Posters proclaimed, "Your blood can save a soldier's life." Radio programs featured testimonials from wounded servicemen whose lives had been saved by plasma transfusions. Newspapers published donor statistics alongside casualty reports, creating a direct connection between home front sacrifice and battlefield survival. The plasma production system that emerged was a marvel of distributed manufacturing. Blood collected at Red Cross centers was shipped daily to processing laboratories in major cities. 16 facilities operated around the clock, each producing thousands of packages per week. The dried plasma was packaged in distinctive tin containers holding 2 cans, one with the plasma powder, one with distilled water for reconstitution. 6 packages fit in an ammunition box for transport and storage. Quality control was obsessive. Every batch underwent sterility testing. Random packages were opened and tested for protein function. The military tracked every package from production through distribution to ensure any problems could be traced back to their source. The success rate remained above 99% throughout the war. The first shipments reached military medical facilities in May 1942. Initial distribution prioritized the Pacific Theater, where distances and tropical heat made whole blood transport impossible. Navy medical officers received training in plasma reconstitution and administration. The packages came with printed instructions, simple enough for a medic with minimal training to follow. Add distilled water to plasma powder. Mix until dissolved. Connect to intravenous line. Administer at controlled flow rate. The results were immediately apparent. Casualties who previously would have died from hemorrhagic shock before reaching field hospitals now survived long enough for surgical intervention. Plasma bought time, the most precious commodity in battlefield medicine. A soldier whose blood pressure was dropping toward fatal levels could receive plasma in minutes, stabilizing circulation long enough for transport to facilities where whole blood and surgery were available. By September 1942, dried plasma had become standard issue for every Navy ship and Marine unit in the Pacific. By December, Army forces in North Africa received full plasma supplies. By mid-1943, American medical facilities worldwide had access to dried plasma in quantities sufficient to treat every casualty requiring volume replacement. The statistics revealed dried plasma's impact with brutal clarity. Hemorrhagic shock mortality rates in the Pacific Theater, 1942. Before plasma deployment, 23% of casualties with major blood loss died before reaching field hospitals. 1943. After plasma deployment, hemorrhagic shock mortality dropped to 8% in forward areas. 1944. With refined administration protocols, mortality fell to 4%. The numbers represented thousands of lives saved, soldiers who survived to return home, families who received reunion letters instead of death notifications. Plasma had transformed battlefield medicine, not through revolutionary surgery or miraculous drugs, but through industrial production applied to human survival itself. Lieutenant Commander Harold Jensen received his first shipment of dried plasma in June 1942 aboard the USS Saratoga. The aircraft carrier was preparing for the Guadalcanal campaign, and Jensen's medical bay had been equipped with 200 packages of plasma, enough for major casualties. He opened one package, following the instructions printed on the tin. The plasma powder looked like dried milk. Mixed with distilled water, it dissolved into a solution that looked, felt, and flowed exactly like fresh plasma. Jensen's first combat use of dried plasma came on August 7, 1942, during the initial Guadalcanal landings. A Marine with a severe leg wound arrived at the medical bay with a barely palpable pulse and falling blood pressure. Jensen reconstituted a plasma package and started the transfusion. Within 10 minutes, the Marine's blood pressure stabilized. Within 30 minutes, he was conscious and responsive. Within 2 hours, he received whole blood transfusion and surgery. He survived. Over the following weeks, as the Guadalcanal campaign ground through its brutal island fighting, Jensen administered dried plasma to dozens of casualties. The success rate was remarkable. Casualties who received plasma within the first hour of injury had survival rates approaching 90%. Those who waited longer, whose shock had progressed to irreversible stages, still showed improved survival, compared to pre-plasma statistics. Jensen kept meticulous records. Patient identification, time of injury, time of first plasma administration, packages used, adverse reactions, outcomes. His data, combined with reports from hundreds of other medical officers, would form the foundation for modern combat casualty care protocols that remain in use 8 decades later. The dried plasma program was not without problems. Some packages contained excessive fibrin particles that clogged administration tubing, requiring filtration. Occasional batches failed sterility testing after distribution, resulting in recalls. Some medical personnel, trained in traditional whole blood transfusion, resisted using a dried powder product they did not fully understand. And plasma, for all its benefits, could not replace red blood cells' oxygen-carrying capacity for casualties with massive blood loss. But these were refinable problems, engineering challenges rather than fundamental limitations. By late 1943, the plasma production system had achieved remarkable consistency. Sterility failures dropped below 1 in 10,000 packages. Protein function testing showed that properly stored plasma remained fully effective for over 2 years, and medical personnel across all services had adopted plasma as first-line treatment for hemorrhagic shock. The scale of production by 1944 was staggering. American Red Cross blood donations exceeded 1 million per month. Processing laboratories produced over 100,000 plasma packages weekly. The military maintained stockpiles of over 2 million packages globally. Navy ships carried plasma sufficient for major battle damage. Field hospitals maintained supplies adequate for sustained operations. Even individual medics carried plasma packages in their aid bags for immediate casualty treatment. The industrial achievement behind this system was as significant as any weapons production program. Dried plasma required coordinated efforts across thousands of organizations, blood donor recruitment and screening, collection and transport logistics, laboratory processing under pharmaceutical quality standards, packaging and sterilization, military distribution networks spanning oceans and continents, training programs for medical personnel at every level. What made the system work was not any single innovation, but the systematic integration of existing technologies applied at unprecedented scale. Freeze-drying was not new. Blood typing was not new. Industrial quality control was not new. But combining these elements into a globally distributed system that could sustain plasma production for millions of casualties over multiple years represented organizational capability that only American industrial society could achieve. By mid-1944, American forces had treated over 1 million casualties with dried plasma. The survival statistics were transforming military medical expectations. Wounds that would have been fatal in previous wars now had survival rates exceeding 50%. Hemorrhagic shock, once the leading cause of battlefield death, had become a manageable condition rather than a death sentence. The psychological impact extended beyond casualty statistics. Soldiers knew that if they were wounded, plasma would be available immediately. That knowledge reduced the psychological burden of combat, the constant awareness that injury meant probable death. Medics knew they had effective treatment for the most common cause of battlefield mortality, which allowed them to focus on other aspects of casualty care. Surgeons knew that casualties would reach them with stable blood pressure and adequate perfusion, which made complex surgical interventions possible that would have been futile without plasma resuscitation. The plasma program's success created pressure to develop even more advanced blood products. If plasma could be dried and preserved, could whole blood be similarly processed? Could red blood cells be separated, concentrated, and stored for extended periods? Could specific clotting factors be isolated and administered to casualties with specialized needs? These questions would drive blood banking research for decades. But in 1944, the immediate need was simpler. Get plasma to every wounded soldier as quickly as possible. The industrial system to accomplish that goal was now functioning at full capacity, processing millions of donations, producing hundreds of thousands of packages, distributing them globally, and saving thousands of lives weekly. Lieutenant Commander Harold Jensen wrote in his private journal in November 1944, "3 years ago at Pearl Harbor, I watched men bleed to death because we had no way to replace what they had lost. Today, I can stabilize a casualty with massive hemorrhage in under 5 minutes. The plasma package weighs less than 2 pounds. It requires no refrigeration. It keeps indefinitely. It works for any blood type, and it works every single time. We are not fighting the same war anymore. We are fighting with different rules, rules where bleeding is no longer synonymous with dying." The transformation Jensen described was not dramatic. There were no miracle cures, no sudden breakthroughs, no moments where death turned instantly to survival. Instead, there was systematic improvement in survival rates, percentage points gained through thousands of successful plasma transfusions, lives saved one package at a time across hundreds of battlefields. By December 1944, the American military medical system had achieved something unprecedented in warfare. They had created an invisible supply line that carried liquid life from American cities to battlefields across the world. They had transformed civilian blood into military medical power. They had made hemorrhagic shock once the terror of battlefield surgeons, into a manageable condition with survival rates approaching those of civilian trauma. The next phase of the war would test whether this achievement could be sustained under the most intense combat conditions yet encountered. As American forces prepared for the final campaigns in Europe and the Pacific, medical planners knew that casualties would reach unprecedented levels. The question was whether the plasma system could scale to meet demands that might exceed 100,000 casualties per month. The answer would come in the spring and summer of 1945, in battles that would produce casualty rates exceeding anything seen in American military history, and in plasma transfusions that would number in the hundreds of thousands. January 15, 1945. The sky above the Philippine Sea was empty of clouds, a vast expanse of tropical blue that offered no shelter from what was coming. Navy Surgeon Commander Robert Mitchell stood on the deck of the USS Idaho, watching the horizon where Japanese-held Luzon waited. In his medical bay below, 200 packages of dried plasma sat stacked in metal boxes, more than the ship had ever carried before. Mitchell had received his orders 2 days earlier. Expect heavy casualties. Prepare for sustained operations. The plasma will be critical. He'd been a Navy surgeon since 1939, had served through Pearl Harbor, Midway, and the island campaigns that followed. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the scale of what was coming. The final campaigns of the Pacific War would test whether American medical innovations could sustain survival rates under casualty volumes that exceeded anything previously encountered. The mathematics of the final campaigns were staggering. The Battle of Iwo Jima, beginning February 19, 1945, would produce 26,000 American casualties in just 36 days of fighting. The Battle of Okinawa, beginning April 1st, would generate over 82,000 American casualties across 82 days of the most intense combat in the Pacific theater. Combined, these two battles would wound more Americans than the entire first 2 years of Pacific operations. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The medical challenge was not just volume but intensity. Iwo Jima was 8 square miles of volcanic rock defended by 21,000 Japanese soldiers who had spent months converting the island into a fortress of interconnected tunnels and bunkers. Every yard of advance would be paid for in blood. Okinawa was 460 square miles of fortified ridges where 100,000 Japanese troops had prepared defensive positions designed specifically to maximize American casualties. Traditional military medical systems would have collapsed under such sustained pressure. Whole blood. Supplies would have been exhausted within days. Field hospitals would have been overwhelmed by casualties arriving faster than surgeons could operate. Hemorrhagic shock mortality would have returned to World War I levels, with 30% of wounded dying from blood loss alone. But American forces in 1945 possessed something unprecedented: an industrial medical supply system capable of delivering dried plasma in quantities sufficient to treat every casualty immediately upon wounding. Commander Mitchell's ship alone carried enough plasma for 400 transfusions. The invasion fleet collectively transported over 100,000 plasma packages, with resupply ships bringing additional thousands weekly. February 19th, 1945, 0900 hours. The first wave of Marines hit the beaches of Iwo Jima under withering fire from concealed positions. Within minutes, casualties began arriving at the offshore medical ships. Mitchell's medical bay filled rapidly. Shrapnel wounds, burns, compound fractures, all accompanied by the same critical problem: hemorrhagic shock from massive blood loss. The plasma protocol was now standardized across all services. Immediate administration to any casualty with signs of shock, no blood typing required, no delays for laboratory testing, just rapid reconstitution and transfusion to restore blood volume and maintain blood pressure until whole blood could be administered. Mitchell worked with mechanical precision. Receive casualty, assess wounds, reconstitute plasma, start transfusion, monitor vital signs, prepare for surgery. The plasma bought time measured in minutes, but those minutes were the difference between surgical success and fatal shock. A Marine with abdominal wounds and barely palpable pulse received 2 units of plasma in rapid succession. His blood pressure stabilized enough for emergency surgery. He survived. Over the next 36 days, Mitchell administered dried plasma to 317 casualties. The survival rate for those receiving plasma within 30 minutes of wounding was 87%. For those receiving plasma after 60 minutes, survival dropped to 62%. The data confirmed what military medical research had predicted. Early plasma transfusion was the single most important factor in hemorrhagic shock survival. The scale of plasma usage at Iwo Jima exceeded all previous operations. Medical ships and field hospitals consumed over 40,000 packages during the battle. The American Red Cross immediately increased blood donation drives to replace depleted stocks. Within 2 weeks, replacement plasma shipments restored inventory levels. The industrial supply system had proven it could sustain medical operations even under the most intense combat conditions. April 1, 1945. The Okinawa invasion began with over 60,000 troops landing on the island's western beaches. The initial landings encountered surprisingly light resistance. But within days, American forces encountered the defensive lines the Japanese had prepared in Okinawa's southern highlands. The fighting that followed would produce casualty rates that horrified military planners and fundamentally shaped decisions about how to end the war. Navy surgeon Lieutenant Commander James Harper commanded medical operations for the hospital ship USS Solace, stationed offshore. His facility could accommodate 200 patients, with operating theaters running continuously. The plasma supplies were the largest he'd ever managed, 5,000 packages stored in temperature-controlled compartments, with additional supplies arriving weekly from resupply vessels. Harper had studied the Iwo Jima medical reports. He knew that plasma usage would be intensive, that casualties would arrive in waves corresponding to offensive operations, and that maintaining adequate supplies would require constant coordination with the medical supply chain. What he did not anticipate was the duration. Iwo Jima had lasted 36 days. Okinawa would continue for 82, with no reduction in casualty rates. The first major casualties arrived April 4 as American forces encountered the Japanese defensive line at Kakazu Ridge. Harper's medical bay filled within hours. The wounds were catastrophic: high-velocity shrapnel from artillery and mortar fire, burns from flamethrowers, crushing injuries from collapsing bunkers, and always, massive hemorrhage that threatened to kill faster than the wounds themselves. The plasma protocol saved lives through sheer repetition. Hundreds of casualties, each receiving immediate plasma transfusion upon arrival. Harper's medical teams developed efficiency that approached industrial assembly. One team assessed and stabilized casualties. Another team prepared plasma. A third team managed transfusions. Surgeons operated continuously, knowing that plasma had stabilized their patients, enough to survive anesthesia and surgery. Over 82 days, the USS Solace treated 4,300 casualties. Plasma usage exceeded 12,000 packages. The survival rate for casualties reaching the ship was 91%, a figure that would have been impossible without immediate plasma resuscitation. Harper's after-action report concluded that dried plasma had been the single most significant factor in casualty survival, exceeding in importance surgical skill, antibiotic availability, or any other medical intervention. The cumulative statistics from Okinawa revealed the full scope of plasma's impact. American casualties totaled over 82,000. Of these, approximately 65,000 required medical treatment for wounds. Approximately 40,000 received plasma transfusions. The hemorrhagic shock mortality rate was 3.7%, down from the 23% observed in early Pacific operations before plasma deployment. Those numbers represented approximately 12,500 soldiers and Marines who survived wounds that would have killed them in previous wars. 12,500 men who returned home to families, rebuilt lives, had children who would never have been born, contributed to post-war society in ways that rippled forward through generations. The broader impact extended beyond individual survival. The high casualty rates at Iwo Jima and Okinawa convinced American military planners that invasion of the Japanese home islands would produce catastrophic losses. Estimates ranged from several 100,000 to over 1 million American casualties. Even with dried plasma and advanced medical capabilities, such casualties would strain military medical systems beyond their limits. President Harry Truman, facing the decision of whether to authorize use of atomic weapons or proceed with invasion, had the Okinawa casualty statistics on his desk. The numbers were unambiguous. Japanese forces would fight with fanatical determination. Civilian casualties would be massive. American casualties would be unprecedented. The decision to use atomic weapons at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was influenced by many factors, but the medical reality of sustaining millions of casualties was certainly among them. August 15, 1945. Japan surrendered. The Pacific War ended. The final casualty statistics were compiled. Over 1 million Americans had been wounded in Pacific operations. Approximately 600,000 had received dried plasma transfusions. The overall hemorrhagic shock mortality rate for the Pacific theater was 6.2%, compared to 23% in World War I and 18% in the early Pacific campaigns before plasma deployment. The American Red Cross blood donation program had collected over 13 million pints of blood between 1942 and 1945. Over 12 million pints had been processed into dried plasma. Over 6 million packages had been produced. Approximately 4 million packages had been distributed to military medical facilities worldwide. The remainder were held in strategic reserve for the planned invasion of Japan that never occurred. The plasma program's success created immediate questions about peacetime applications. If dried plasma could be mass-produced for military use, could similar systems provide blood products for civilian hospitals? Could the organizational infrastructure developed during wartime be adapted for peacetime medicine? Could the industrial processes that had saved soldiers' lives be applied to saving civilian lives? The answers would unfold over the following decades, but the foundation had been established. Blood donation as civic duty rather than commercial transaction, standardized collection and processing protocols, industrial-scale production with pharmaceutical-grade quality control, distributed supply, networks capable of delivering blood products wherever needed. These concepts, proven in war, would reshape civilian medicine. Lieutenant Commander Harold Jensen, who had witnessed the Pearl Harbor disaster and filed the report that helped initiate the plasma program, returned to civilian practice in 1946. He established a blood bank at Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago, using dried plasma until refrigerated, whole blood storage became practical. When interviewed in 1952 for a medical journal article about wartime innovations, Jensen reflected on the transformation he had witnessed. In December 1941, we had no effective treatment for hemorrhagic shock in mass casualty situations. Blood could not be stored, transported, or administered rapidly enough to matter. By August 1945, we could transfuse any casualty anywhere with a product that was sterile, stable, universally compatible, and immediately effective. The change was not gradual. It was revolutionary. And it happened because America possessed the industrial capacity to transform medical research into mass production, the organizational capability to distribute millions of packages globally, and the civic commitment to donate blood as an act of patriotism. Jensen's assessment captured the essential nature of the plasma program's success. It was not a single invention or discovery, but a systematic integration of multiple capabilities: scientific understanding of blood physiology, industrial freeze-drying technology, pharmaceutical quality control, military logistics, civilian volunteer networks, government coordination. Each element was necessary. None alone was sufficient. The plasma program also revealed something profound about industrial warfare. The nation that could mobilize its entire society for production, that could convert civilian industries to military purposes, that could organize millions of citizens for collective effort, possessed advantages that no amount of tactical brilliance or individual heroism could overcome. Germany and Japan had brilliant scientists, courageous soldiers, and sophisticated military tactics, but neither could match America's ability to produce medical supplies in quantities sufficient to sustain global operations for 4 years. Dr. Edwin Cohn, who had led the plasma production research program, received numerous honors after the war. The American Medical Association awarded him its Distinguished Service Medal. Harvard University named him chairman of biological chemistry. But Kohn consistently deflected personal credit, insisting that the plasma program's success resulted from collective effort rather than individual genius. In a 1948 address to the American Chemical Society, Kohn stated, "The dried plasma program succeeded not because any individual possessed unique insight, but because American society possessed unique capabilities. We had universities that could conduct research. We had industries that could scale production. We had citizens willing to donate blood. We had government willing to coordinate efforts. We had military willing to implement innovations. The plasma that saved soldiers' lives was, in the most literal sense, a product of American civilization itself." Kohn's observation extended beyond medical history to illuminate the nature of technological advancement in the 20th century. Innovation was no longer the work of isolated inventors in workshops. It required coordinated efforts across institutions, sustained investment over years, and systematic integration of multiple disciplines. The plasma program embodied this new reality, demonstrating that modern technological achievement emerged from organizational capability as much as individual insight. The long-term legacy of the wartime plasma program shaped multiple fields. In medicine, it established blood banking as standard practice, created protocols for emergency transfusion that remain in use, and proved that industrial production could be applied to biological materials. In public health, it demonstrated that voluntary blood donation could sustain medical supply needs, creating the model for modern blood services. In industrial organization, it showed how government, universities, and private companies could collaborate on large-scale projects with humanitarian purposes. The specific techniques of plasma production evolved rapidly after the war. Freeze-drying remained the standard preservation method, but improvements in equipment and protocols increased yields and reduced costs. By the 1950s, dried plasma had been largely replaced by frozen plasma, which offered better protein preservation and simpler storage requirements. By the 1970s, improved refrigeration and blood banking allowed most hospitals to maintain adequate whole blood supplies, reducing reliance on plasma alone. But the fundamental principle remained unchanged. Blood could be collected from healthy donors, processed into stable products, stored for extended periods, transported across distances, and administered to casualties without blood typing. This principle, proven in World War II, became the foundation for modern trauma medicine. Every emergency room, every ambulance, every military medical facility operates on infrastructure and protocols that trace directly to the wartime plasma program. The human impact extended across generations. The 12,500 men saved by plasma at Okinawa returned home. Many married, had children, built careers, contributed to their communities. Their descendants number in the hundreds of thousands. The ripple effects of those saved lives spread through families, neighborhoods, businesses, churches, schools, creating connections that shaped post-war American society in ways impossible to quantify but undeniable in their existence. Consider one example. Marine Corporal Thomas Mitchell survived severe wounds at Okinawa after receiving emergency plasma transfusion. He returned to Iowa, married his high school sweetheart, and raised 4 children. One of his sons became a surgeon, inspired by the medical care that had saved his father's life. That surgeon trained hundreds of medical students over his career, several of whom pioneered innovations in emergency medicine. The lineage of impact from one plasma transfusion extended through decades and touched thousands of lives. Multiply that example by 12,500, and the full scope of the plasma program's human legacy begins to emerge. Not just individual lives saved, but entire family trees that would not have existed, contributions that would not have been made, futures that would not have unfolded. The dried plasma packages that seemed like simple medical supplies were, in retrospect, vessels containing uncounted futures, potential lives saved and released into the world. The industrial achievement was equally significant. America's ability to produce 6 million plasma packages during the war demonstrated manufacturing capabilities that shaped post-war economic dominance. The pharmaceutical industry that emerged after 1945, built on facilities, personnel, and expertise developed during wartime medical production. The blood banking industry that provides millions of transfusions annually traces its organizational structure to wartime collection networks. The civic dimension created lasting cultural changes. Blood donation became a routine aspect of American citizenship, with tens of millions of Americans donating regularly throughout their lives. The concept that ordinary citizens could directly save lives through simple acts of donation created a model that extended beyond blood to organ donation, bone marrow donation, and other forms of biological gift-giving that characterize modern medicine. December 7, 1951. Harold Jensen stood in a blood donation center in Chicago, watching volunteers line up to give blood for Korean War casualties. 10 years had passed since Pearl Harbor, and the medical landscape had transformed completely. Blood banks operated in every major city. Dried plasma remained standard issue for military medical units. Whole blood could be flown anywhere in the world within 48 hours. Hemorrhagic shock mortality rates continued declining as techniques improved. Jensen thought about the 17 men he'd watched die at Pearl Harbor because no blood was available. He thought about the plasma program that had emerged from that disaster. He thought about the hundreds of thousands of casualties who had survived because industrial medicine had learned to deliver liquid life to battlefields. And he thought about the future, wondering what other medical miracles might emerge when society organized its full capabilities towards saving lives rather than taking them. The lesson of the plasma program was not that war drives innovation, though it often does. The lesson was that human societies possess capabilities far exceeding what they typically deploy. The same nation that produced 6 million plasma packages in 4 years took decades to address infant mortality, infectious disease, and other preventable deaths in peacetime. The organizational capabilities existed, the industrial capacity existed, the scientific knowledge existed. What varied was the commitment to apply those capabilities systematically toward humanitarian ends. The wartime plasma program demonstrated what becomes possible when a society decides that saving lives matters more than any other consideration, when it mobilizes its full resources toward that goal, when it organizes universities, industries, government, and citizens into coordinated effort. The tragedy was that such mobilization seemed to require war as catalyst. The hope was that lessons learned in war might eventually be applied in peace. By 1955, a decade after the war's end, the American Red Cross had established permanent blood donation programs in every state. The plasma production techniques developed during the war had been refined for civilian use. Hospitals maintained blood banks sufficient for routine and emergency needs. The industrial infrastructure that had supported military medical supply during the war now sustained civilian medicine. The veterans who had received plasma transfusions were entering middle age, raising families, building careers, becoming the backbone of post-war society. Few knew the full story of how dried plasma had been developed, mass-produced, and deployed on their behalf. Most simply knew that they had been wounded, received medical treatment, and survived. The industrial and organizational miracle that had made their survival possible remained largely invisible, buried in military medical records and academic publications. But the miracle had occurred nonetheless. Between 1942 and 1945, American society had created something unprecedented, a medical supply system capable of delivering life-saving treatment to hundreds of thousands of casualties across battlefields, spanning 2 oceans and 4 continents. A system that combined scientific research, industrial production, volunteer civic participation, and military logistics into a single, coordinated program. A system that reduced hemorrhagic shock mortality from over 20% to under 4% through nothing more than dried blood plasma in tin cans. The plasma packages themselves were unremarkable. Small metal containers weighing less than 2 pounds each, contents worth perhaps $5 in production costs. No sophisticated electronics, no complex machinery, no advanced materials, just freeze-dried human plasma, distilled water, and simple reconstitution instructions. Yet these humble packages contained the most sophisticated medical technology of their era, embodying decades of research into blood physiology, industrial processes refined through thousands of production batches, and organizational systems that coordinated millions of individual actions into a functioning whole. When the last packages of wartime dried plasma were finally discarded in the 1960s, replaced by superior frozen plasma and modern blood banking, few noticed. The packages had served their purpose. The lives had been saved. The legacy endured in protocols, institutions, and the children of men who would have died without them. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The story of dried plasma in World War II is not a story of miracle cures or dramatic breakthroughs. It is a story of systematic improvement, of industrial capabilities applied to humanitarian purposes, of organizational innovation that mattered as much as scientific discovery. It is the story of how a nation mobilized its full resources to ensure that its soldiers did not bleed to death on distant battlefields, and in doing so, created the foundation for modern trauma medicine. The 12,500 men who survived Okinawa because of plasma transfusions never met Edwin Cohn, never knew the names of the technicians who processed their plasma, never spoke with the blood donors who made their survival possible. But they lived. And their living was the legacy. Every descendant, every contribution, every life touched by those who survived, represents the ultimate measure of the plasma program's success. Sometimes the most powerful weapons in war are not designed to destroy but to preserve, not to kill but to save, not to take life but to sustain it. The dried plasma program was one such weapon, a weapon that won its battles one transfusion at a time, one stabilized casualty at a time, one life saved at a time. And in the end, it won completely, transforming battlefield medicine from a desperate effort to delay death into a systematic capability to preserve life. The final casualty statistics tell the story in numbers that speak across decades. Over 1 million Americans wounded, over 600,000 plasma transfusions administered, hemorrhagic shock mortality reduced from 23% to under 4%, 12,500 lives saved at Okinawa alone, tens of thousands more across all Pacific and European operations. Hundreds of thousands of descendants who exist because industrial medicine learned to deliver life in a package. These are the true mathematics of the plasma program. Not production statistics or supply chain efficiencies or industrial capabilities, though those mattered, but lives saved, futures preserved, families continued. The arithmetic of survival that counts in heartbeats rather than units, in years lived rather than packages produced, in children born rather than casualties. Recorded. Lieutenant Commander Harold Jensen died in 1973, 32 years after Pearl Harbor. His obituary in the Journal of the American Medical Association mentioned his role in advocating for dried plasma development, but devoted most of its space to his post-war contributions to blood banking and trauma medicine. The 17 men he watched die in December 1941 went unmentioned, but Jensen had spent 3 decades ensuring that no doctor would have to watch 17 men die from treatable hemorrhagic shock ever again. That was the legacy. Not glory or recognition, but systematic improvement in human survival. Not miracle cures or dramatic rescue, but organized effort to apply existing knowledge at sufficient scale to matter. Not individual heroism, but collective capability mobilized toward preserving life. The dried plasma program succeeded because it represented everything America could accomplish when it decided that success mattered more than tonnes cost, more than difficulty, more than tradition. It mobilized universities to conduct research. It mobilized industries to scale production. It mobilized citizens to donate blood. It mobilized government to coordinate effort. It mobilized military to implement innovation. And it mobilized all of these capabilities simultaneously, systematically, relentlessly, until the problem was solved. The problem was soldiers bleeding to death on battlefields. The solution was industrial medicine applied at global scale. The result was 12,500 men walking off Okinawa who should have died there, and tens of thousands more walking off other battlefields across the Pacific and Europe. Men who came home, rebuilt their lives, and lived their futures because dried plasma in tin cans bought them minutes, and those minutes bought them decades. That is how wars are truly won. Not by the biggest guns or the fastest ships or the most brilliant tactics, but by the systematic determination to ensure that those who fight can survive, that those who fall can rise, that those who bleed can be saved. By the recognition that industrial capability matters as much as military courage, that organizational innovation matters as much as tactical brilliance, that saving lives matters as much as taking them. The plasma program proved these truths through 6 million packages distributed across 4 years and 2 oceans, through 12 million blood donations from American citizens who never met the soldiers they saved, through 400,000 successful transfusions that turned shock into survival and death into life, and through 12,500 men who walked away from Okinawa, carrying with them all the years they would live, all the families they would raise, all the futures they would build, men who owed their survival to freeze-dried plasma in metal containers, produced in factories by workers they would never know, delivered by supply chains they would never see, administered by medics whose names they would never learn. That invisible army of donors, processors, transporters, and medical personnel won their battle completely. They won it so thoroughly that their victory became invisible, absorbed into the background of history as simply how things worked. The plasma was there. The casualties survived. The war ended. Life continued. But the victory was real nonetheless. Real in every heartbeat of every descendant of every man saved. Real in every contribution made by survivors who should have been casualties. Real in every hospital blood bank that traces its lineage to wartime plasma production. Real in every trauma protocol that builds on lessons learned when industrial medicine was applied at global scale. The men saved by plasma did not know they were making history. They knew only that they were wounded, treated, and survived. The medics who administered plasma did not know they were revolutionizing medicine. They knew only that the treatment worked. The donors who gave blood did not know they were creating modern blood banking. They knew only that their blood might save a soldier's life. Yet together, unknowingly, they created something unprecedented. A medical supply system capable of sustaining survival rates under catastrophic casualty volumes. An industrial achievement that matched any weapons production program. An organizational innovation that proved societies could mobilize their full capabilities towards saving lives. A legacy that endures in every emergency room, every blood bank, every trauma center that operates on principles proven when 12,500 men survived Okinawa because industrial America learned to package life in metal containers. That is the story of dried plasma in World War II. Not a miracle, but a systematic triumph of industrial organization applied to human survival. Not individual genius, but collective capability mobilized toward humanitarian purpose. Not dramatic rescue, but quiet persistence in reducing mortality, 1 percentage point at a time, until bleeding was no longer synonymous with dying. The 12,500 men saved at Okinawa never knew they were statistics proving a principle. They knew only that they lived. And their living, multiplied across all the battlefields where plasma made the difference between death and survival, created a legacy measured not in numbers but in futures, not in packages but in generations, not in production statistics but in lives fully lived, because industrial medicine learned how to give them the minutes they needed to survive.